December 20, 1944. Luxembourg City, 10:47 a.m. General Omar Bradley stands rigid in his command post, knuckles white against the edge of his map table. The phone receiver rests in its cradle, but he can still hear Eisenhower's voice echoing in his skull. Two of his armies, 200,000 American soldiers, have just been stripped from his command. Handed over to British Field Marshal. His jaw clenches so hard his aide hears teeth grinding from across the room. For 3 days, German panzers have been tearing through the Ardennes forest, and now this, the ultimate humiliation. Bernard Montgomery will command American troops on the northern shoulder of what's becoming the largest battle the United States Army has ever fought. And Bradley, the man they call the soldier's general, can do nothing but watch. He paces the room like a caged animal, anger radiating off him in waves. Outside, snow falls on a Luxembourg already choked, with refugees fleeing the German onslaught. Inside, Bradley mutters a single word that his aide Chester Hansen will record in his diary. Unforgivable, this is the story of how two Allied generals, both fighting the same enemy, became so consumed by rivalry and pride that they failed to see the greatest German counteroffensive coming. A story of ignored intelligence, severed communications, and a press conference that nearly destroyed the Allied coalition. A story that asks one haunting question: how many American lives were lost not to German bullets, but to Allied egos? November 1944. The war is supposed to be over by Christmas. After the liberation of Paris in August, Allied optimism reached euphoric heights. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands at his headquarters in Belgium, studying maps with the confidence of a man who's never lost a major battle. At 57, he's Britain's greatest living general, victor of El Alamein, the man who broke Rommel, precise, meticulous, utterly convinced of his own brilliance. He wears his trademark beret and speaks in clipped, authoritative tones that brook no disagreement. 300 miles south, Omar Bradley commands the American 12th Army Group from Luxembourg. At 51, he's everything Montgomery is not. Modest, unassuming, a farm boy from Missouri who graduated from West Point with the class of 1915, the class the stars fell on. His men love him because he doesn't grandstand. He doesn't wear fancy uniforms or give bombastic speeches. He just wins battles quietly, methodically, without fanfare. But beneath Bradley's calm exterior burns a resentment that's been building for months. Montgomery commands 21st Army Group in the north. Bradley commands the 12th Army Group, covering a much larger front. On paper, they're equals, both reporting directly to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. In reality, Montgomery treats Bradley like a subordinate, constantly lobbying Eisenhower to give him overall ground command, to make Bradley answer to him. The tension explodes in September when Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, his bold plan to end the war by Christmas, turns into a catastrophic failure at Arnhem. Thousands of British paratroopers are killed or captured. Montgomery blames everyone but himself. Bradley watches from the south, vindicated but too professional to say "I told you so." The gulf between the two men widens into a chasm. By November, both commanders are convinced they know how to win the war. Montgomery wants a concentrated thrust in the north, a single powerful spearhead aimed at Berlin with himself in command. Bradley and his protégé, George Patton, want a broad front strategy, multiple armies pushing forward simultaneously. They spend more time arguing with each other than studying the enemy. And the enemy is watching. November 24, 1944, Nancy, France, 3rd Army Headquarters. General George Patton leans back in his chair, cigar smoke curling around his pearl-handled revolvers. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, stands at the map board, pointer in hand, face grave. Koch is 47, German-speaking, meticulous, the opposite of his flamboyant commander in every way except competence. "Sir," The Germans are building up east of the Ardennes, Koch says. His voice is steady but urgent. I count at least 10 divisions we can't account for, fresh divisions, panzer divisions. He taps the map where the Ardennes forest bulges into Belgium. First Army is making a terrible mistake by leaving VIII Corps static there. The Germans are probably building up for a counteroffensive. Patton takes the cigar from his mouth and studies the map. Most generals would dismiss this as fantasy. The Germans are beaten, everyone says so. They're defending the Rhine with old men and boys, but Patton doesn't think like most generals. Oscar, you're probably right, he says quietly. Start making plans. We might need to move north fast. Koch takes his warnings up the chain. First Army's intelligence chief, Colonel Benjamin Monk Dixon, shares similar concerns. But at 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg, Bradley's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Seibert, can't quite commit. On December 12, Seibert tells Bradley the breaking point may develop suddenly and without warning, but in the same breath he hedges. He notes the German capability for attack but won't say it will actually happen. He's afraid of being called a defeatist. Bradley hears what he wants to hear. The Germans are finished. The Ardennes is a quiet sector, perfect for resting battered divisions and blooding new ones. He leaves it defended by just 4 divisions stretched across 80 miles of forest and hills. A calculated risk, he calls it. Koch calls it a disaster waiting to happen, and Montgomery. Up north, he's so confident the Germans are beaten that on December 15, one day before the attack, he tells his troops, the enemy is at present fighting a defensive campaign on all fronts. His situation is such that he cannot stage major offensive operations. Bradley voices the same opinion. 2 of the Allied Army Group commanders are blind to what's coming. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes forest erupts in fire. 2,000 German artillery pieces open up simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The ground shakes, trees explode. American soldiers stumble from their foxholes and dugouts to find an entire German army emerging from the mist. Panzers, thousands of them, SS troops in white winter camouflage. Screaming Nebelwerfer rockets, it's a blitzkrieg, and the Americans are caught completely by surprise. Within hours, entire regiments are surrounded. The Green 106th Infantry Division, just arrived in the theater, collapses. 2 of its regiments, more than 7,000 men, will surrender within days, the worst capitulation of American forces in the European theater. German spearheads punch through the thin American lines, racing west toward the Meuse River and beyond it, Antwerp. Hitler's grand gamble is underway. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower grasps the situation immediately. That's no spoiling attack, he snaps when Bradley tries to downplay the assault. Ike overrides his friend without hesitation, ordering the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to rush to the Ardennes. But Bradley, for one of the few times in his career, seems paralyzed. He doesn't visit 1st Army Commander Courtney Hodges. He stays in Luxembourg, away from the chaos, insisting that moving his headquarters would cause panic. For 3 critical days, Bradley remains isolated while the German offensive gathers momentum. His telephone lines to 1st Army at Spa are cut by German commandos. Communications become impossible. At 1st Army headquarters, Hodges himself is incapacitated. Some say with viral pneumonia, others describe him sitting at his desk with his head in his arms, barely functional. The 1st Army staff evacuates Spa in such panic that they leave classified maps pinned to the walls and Christmas presents unwrapped on desks. Meanwhile, Montgomery sees the crisis developing and acts with characteristic decisiveness. On December 19, he sends his Chief of Staff, Freddie de Gingand, to SHAEF with a proposal: split the command. Put Montgomery in charge of all forces north of the German penetration, including 1st and 9th Armies, and let Bradley handle the southern response with Patton's Third Army. It's the logical solution. The German Bulge has physically severed Bradley's communications with his northern armies, but it's also the one thing Bradley cannot stomach. That night, December 19, at SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff Bedell Smith convenes a midnight meeting with his top British officers, Kenneth Strong and Jock Whiteley. They spread a map on the floor, use a captured German sword as a pointer, and identify the crisis. Smith explodes at the suggestion of giving Montgomery command of American troops, calling Strong and Whiteley sons of bitches and limey bastards. He fires them both on the spot. Then he calls Bradley. It's 3:00 a.m. Ike thinks it may be a good idea to turn over to Monty your two armies on the north, Smith says. He describes it as the logical thing to do. Bradley's response is fury barely contained by military discipline. The two men who have been classmates at West Point, friends for 30 years, argue bitterly. Finally, Bradley says what he's thinking. By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign. Eisenhower's voice turns cold. Brad, those are my orders. The line goes dead. Bradley paces his Luxembourg command post for hours, rage and humiliation warring in his chest. His aide Hansen will write that he's never seen Bradley like this, cold fury, cursing Montgomery. For the rest of his life, Bradley will blame Montgomery for this moment, convinced that Monty manipulated Eisenhower into the decision. The truth is more painful. Bradley's failure to move his headquarters, his loss of communications, and his paralysis in the first critical days made the change necessary. December 20, 1944, morning. Montgomery arrives at 1st Army headquarters like a desert wind sweeping through a defeated garrison. He strides in wearing his beret and sheepskin coat, radiating confidence, and immediately starts issuing orders. He meets with corps commanders, repositions divisions, and establishes clear lines of defense. Where Hodges seemed overwhelmed, Montgomery is energized. He sees opportunity. The situation is being gripped, he tells his officers with satisfaction, and he is gripping it. Montgomery pulls British XXX Corps into position behind the Meuse as a blocking force. He orders American units to consolidate, to stop retreating, to hold key road junctions at all costs. At St. Vith and Bastogne, American troops make heroic stands that blunt the German advance. Montgomery's hand is evident in the northern sector's stiffening resistance, but he can't help himself. He starts talking. The Americans have taken a real bloody nose, he tells his staff. It's a good thing I'm here to pull them out of this mess. His British officers nod in agreement. They've always believed Montgomery is the superior general. Now events seem to prove it. What Montgomery doesn't understand is that his words are being repeated, spreading through headquarters, eventually reaching American ears. On December 22, Patton's Third Army executes the impossible. In just 72 hours, Patton disengages 6 divisions from active combat, wheels them 90 degrees north, and drives them through a blizzard into the southern flank of the German Bulge. It's one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history. Patton's divisions smashed into the German southern flank, relieving besieged Bastogne on December 26. The American counteroffensive has begun, and still Montgomery hesitates in the north. Bradley and Patton are champing at the bit, pushing forward aggressively. Montgomery wants to wait, to let the German offensive spend itself, to counterattack only when conditions are perfect. It's the same methodical approach that won him El Alamein. But to the Americans, it looks like timidity. The complaints start flowing to Eisenhower. Why isn't Monty attacking? Why is he letting American boys do all the dying? Montgomery files his own complaints. The Americans are too impetuous, he says. They don't understand proper military doctrine. What they need is a ground forces commander to coordinate everything, and he suggests himself for the job. Eisenhower, caught between his feuding commanders, tries to keep the peace. But the pressure is building toward an explosion. January 7, 1945, Montgomery's headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. The battle is effectively won. The German offensive has failed. American forces have retaken almost all the lost ground. The Bulge is being systematically eliminated. It's time to mend fences, to praise Allied cooperation. Churchill has already urged Montgomery to be gracious about American achievements. Montgomery calls a press conference. British and American correspondents crowd into the room. The field marshal stands before them, confident, almost jovial. For an hour, he lectures without notes, describing the battle in detail. He praises Eisenhower. He praises the American fighting spirit. He says all the right things, but then he says the wrong things. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river, he declares. I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. You thus see the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who have suffered a hard blow. He continues, describing how he headed the attack, how British forces saved the situation, and how he personally organized the defense. To Montgomery, he's simply stating facts. To American ears and the German propaganda machine, he's claiming he rescued the Americans from disaster. The implication is clear. Without Montgomery, the Americans would have been destroyed. The reaction is instantaneous and volcanic. At Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg, officers crowd around the radio as German radio broadcasts Montgomery's words, spinning them even more negatively. Bradley goes white, then red. "That son of a bitch," someone mutters. Hansen records that Bradley's anger is the most violent I've ever seen from him. Patton reaches for his diary and writes one of his most bitter entries, questioning whether Montgomery is trying to steal credit for American blood. Bradley calls Eisenhower. He's done being diplomatic. Either Montgomery goes or he does. He means it this time. He'll resign, go home, hold a press conference of his own, and tell the American people what really happened. Several other American generals, including Patton, made the same threat. The Allied coalition is minutes from fracturing completely. Eisenhower is caught in a nightmare. He can't fire Montgomery, the British public would never stand for it, and he needs Churchill's support. He can't accept Bradley's resignation. It would look like a German victory, an admission of failure. He spends desperate hours on the phone, trying to calm everyone down, trying to explain that Montgomery didn't mean it the way it sounded. In London, Winston Churchill sees the disaster unfolding. On January 18, he rises in the House of Commons and delivers a carefully worded speech. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, Churchill declares, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. It's a direct rebuke to Montgomery without naming him. It's also political damage control to save the alliance. Montgomery, stunned by the reaction, writes a letter to Bradley attempting to smooth things over. It arrives too late and rings hollow. The wound is too deep. Bradley will carry his resentment for the rest of his life, convinced that Montgomery tried to steal credit for American sacrifices. In his memoirs, he'll call it unforgivable. The two men's relationship never recovers. But here's the bitter truth beneath the drama. The Battle of the Bulge was won not by Montgomery or Bradley or even Patton, but by American soldiers standing their ground in frozen foxholes around Bastogne and St. Vith, by junior officers making split-second decisions when their commanders were absent or paralyzed, by supply troops fighting as infantry and engineers, blowing bridges as panzers approached. The real heroes were men whose names don't appear in the history books, who died in forests whose names they couldn't pronounce, while generals hundreds of miles away argued about credit. The intelligence failure that made the battle possible was collective. Montgomery didn't refuse to share intelligence with Bradley. They all had access to the same ultra-decrypts, the same prisoner interrogations, the same reconnaissance photos. They simply couldn't believe the Germans were capable of such an offensive. They were so focused on their own plans, so consumed by their rivalry for primacy, that they couldn't see the enemy massing in front of them. Oscar Koch saw it. His warnings were noted and filed. Patton took them seriously and prepared contingency plans. But Koch's intelligence didn't flow up to Bradley's headquarters with the urgency it deserved, and even if it had, Bradley probably would have dismissed it like he dismissed Koch's initial warnings. The Americans were winning. The Germans were beaten. Why worry about shadows in the Ardennes? The Battle of the Bulge lasted from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. The United States Army suffered 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. It remains the bloodiest battle American forces fought in World War II. The German offensive failed, but it delayed the Allied advance into Germany by 6 weeks and cost irreplaceable lives on both sides. Montgomery never understood why his press conference caused such fury. To him, he was simply stating facts, giving a professional assessment of the battle. He didn't see the subtext, the implication, the way his words could be twisted. He lived in a mental world where his genius was self-evident, and stating obvious truths couldn't possibly give offense. This blind spot, this inability to understand how others perceived him, was perhaps his greatest flaw as a coalition commander. Bradley never forgave him. In the decades after the war, as both men wrote their memoirs and gave interviews, they refought the Battle of the Bulge with words instead of armies. Montgomery maintained he saved the Americans. Bradley maintained he never needed saving. The truth, as always, was more complex than either man would admit. Eisenhower, exhausted from playing referee, decided after the war. When he wrote his memoirs, he praised both men but made clear what he'd learned. Coalition warfare requires more than military skill. It requires empathy, tact, and the ability to see beyond national pride to common purpose. Without those qualities, even the best generals can lose sight of what matters. The rivalry between Montgomery and Bradley didn't cost the Allies the Battle of the Bulge. American resilience and German overreach did that. But it did cost something perhaps equally important: the chance for Allied commanders to focus entirely on defeating the enemy rather than competing with each other. It cost clarity in the crucial days before the German attack, when warning signs went unheeded because commanders were looking at each other instead of at the Germans. It cost unity of command when unity was most needed. And it raises a question that echoes through every coalition war. How do you make allies who speak the same language actually communicate? How do you prevent professional competition from becoming personal animosity? How do you ensure that intelligence reaches the commanders who need it most, and that they're willing to believe it even when it contradicts their assumptions? The Battle of the Bulge answered those questions with blood. 75 years later, the answers still matter. So what do you think? Was the intelligence failure inevitable, or could better communication between Allied commanders have prevented the surprise? And how much did personal rivalry between generals cost in soldiers' lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more untold stories from World War II coming your way. And here's a question worth considering. Would you rather serve under a brilliant general who can't work with allies, or a competent one who understands coalition warfare? The men who died in the Ardennes might have had an answer. Thanks for watching.